Everyone thinks they're safe until the glass breaks. That night, it didn't just crack, it detonated. I was upright before the last shard touched the floor, instincts firing awake like a forgotten weapon. One breath to clear the fog. One. Glance at Fran. Wide eyes, clutching the sheets, her face caught in the moonlight. I had promised her she'd never have to wear that look again, the same one she had when she'd wait for me at airfields, unsure if the man stepping off the plane was the same one who had left. Seeing it now felt like a betrayal carved straight into my chest. I pressed a finger to my lips. She knew the drill. Stay put, stay silent. The house transformed in an instant. No longer a quiet ranch wrapped in the comfort of history, but a battlefield in waiting. I slid down the hallway barefoot, every step measured. 2 centuries of Petersons had built this place into a refuge. Tonight, it wasn't refuge. It was ground zero. 2 shadows drifted clumsily across my living room, acting like they had rented the place by the hour. Not burglars, message men. One prodded at the new flat screen, as if the pawn shop price tag mattered more than the memories we'd watched on it. The other lifted a small painting from the mantel, holding it up to the moonlight like an art critic. A child's sunflower, messy and lopsided, painted by our 7-year-old niece. Worthless in money, priceless in meaning. They couldn't tell the difference. And that right there was the heart of it. They didn't understand the things that matter. No gun. Too loud. Noise brings paperwork. Quiet was better. The fire poker leaned by the hearth, black iron, honest weight. Fran's father had given it to split logs. Tonight, it would split intentions. I stepped into their orbit. The TV man blinked, confusion flickering before the lights went out. The poker whispered across his skull, a dull thud, and he folded like bad scaffolding. I didn't speed up. I narrowed. The other one dropped the sunflower painting with a clatter, spinning toward me with a short crowbar raised high. His swing was heavy, angry, but slow. The kind of strike that telegraphs its own defeat. I dipped under, the air brushing across my hair. As he stumbled off balance, I jabbed the poker up into his chin. His teeth clicked with a sound that made my own jaw ache. He dropped stiff, crashing to the floor, silence swallowing the house whole again. 2 down, just the sound of my breathing and the distant wail of a siren. Freddie? Good old paranoid. Freddie, the neighbor who watched the valley through his blinds like a hawk. A moth brushing his porch light was enough to get him dialing 911. Tonight, I was grateful. The 2 men still breathed, shallow, steady, out cold but alive. From the kitchen drawer came zip ties, relics of a past life I had tried to bury. In under a minute, they were hog-tied, wrists and ankles bound. When the first squad car painted the walls red and blue, the intruders were already gift-wrapped. A deputy clocked the scene, broken glass, 2 unconscious men bound neat as packages, me barefoot and calm. His eyes narrowed. "Military?" he asked. "Used to be," I answered. He nodded like that explained the whole floor decor. Fran appeared at the stairwell, robe pulled tight, her eyes finding mine. The fear was gone, replaced by something heavier. Resignation. Her lips trembled. "This is her, isn't it?" I didn't need to ask who she meant. There was only one name that fit. Karen Grant, President, Treasurer, Queen of the Cedar Valley HOA. Her violation notices had been arriving for weeks, clipped little reminders that our door was painted the wrong shade, that Fran's flowers weren't authorized, that our garbage cans sat too long by the curb. At first we laughed. Petty tyranny from a bored woman with too much time and a clipboard. But this wasn't petty anymore. "Yeah," I whispered back. "It's her." The doorbell chimed sharp and demanding. The police were here, but so was the truth. As they logged weapons and statements, I stared at the glitter of shattered glass across the floor. This wasn't about bylaw violations anymore. This was escalation. This was declaration. Karen Grant, had just made her first open move. She thought I was another suburban dad, the kind who'd cower at threats and bend under her rules. She had no idea who I was, and she was about to find out. Everyone thought the storm had passed, but I knew better. The break-in wasn't an end. It was a beginning. The real war hadn't started yet. By morning, the evidence was neatly boxed up, the intruders in custody, the glass swept, the porch cam footage burned onto a drive. Sheriff Daniels promised extra patrols, deputies on rotation down our road. But his tone carried something else. The quiet look cops give when they know trouble has only stretched its legs. 5 years earlier, I had walked away from that life. I won't bore you with the details, but let's just say my job involved going to dangerous places and dealing with dangerous people. I was good at it. Too good. But every mission carved something out of me until I didn't recognize the man in the mirror anymore. Fran was the only anchor I had, the one who saw past the scars no one else could see. For her, I'd quit. For her, I had tried to become ordinary. We wanted boring. We wanted peace. Across the county road, Cedar Valley Estates had looked like the dream. White fences, green lawns so perfect they looked artificial, mailboxes lined up like soldiers. But all of that order had come at a price. Karen Grant. She had introduced herself the day we moved in, clipboard in hand instead of a welcome basket. Her helmet of hairspray never shifted, her smile never touched her eyes. "These," she had said crisply, handing over a 300-page binder, "are the bylaws. We pride ourselves on maintaining standards here." It hadn't been a welcome, it had been a warning. At first, the harassment had felt almost laughable. A notice that our garbage cans had stayed out 2 hours too long. A fine because flowers weren't on the approved species list. Another because our paint trim was sun-kissed ivory instead of whispering wheat. Petty tyrannies, little digs meant to wear us down. We complied, paid the fines, swallowed the pride, all for peace. But peace was something Karen never intended to give. Late that afternoon, her silver Lexus appeared at the end of our ranch road. She stepped out flanked by 2 men in suits, one carrying a briefcase, the other an iPad. She handed me papers that claimed to be a deed transfer, notarized and official-looking, authorizing the sale of our land for a new access road. The problem? I had never signed a damn thing. I tore it in half in front of her. The smile on her lips evaporated. For the first time, I saw the steel behind her eyes. She didn't hesitate. From inside her blazer, she pulled a snub-nosed revolver, raising it steady, cold. "Last chance," she said. Time slowed. I stepped in, twisted her wrist, and dropped her hard into the gravel. The gun fired skyward, punching a hole through the barn roof. The suits froze, but headlights crested the ridge. Sheriff Daniels' truck, red and blue lights flashing. The timing was either luck or divine. Daniels swept in, confiscated the revolver, bagged the forged documents, and radioed deputies to intercept Karen's fleeing men. On paper, it looked like justice, but Fran knew better. She'd been the one standing on the porch with a white envelope every other week, her hands trembling with the latest fine, the latest reminder that we were under siege. Each little cut had drained her until her joy dulled, until she was a shadow of herself. And now Karen had crossed a line. That night, I sat in the kitchen long after Fran had gone upstairs. The coffee pot hissed and clicked behind me as I stared out at the quiet street. The truth pressed down heavy. This wasn't just about rules or fines anymore. Karen had shifted from scalpel to sledgehammer, from citations to crowbars, from ink to blood. Why? Why escalate like this? Karen was cruel, yes, petty, absolutely, but she was also cunning. Too cunning to risk armed men and forged deeds unless something bigger was at stake. Fines and flowers didn't explain it. Fear of power slipping through her fingers didn't explain it. No, something else was driving her. The police could make arrests, they could file reports, but I knew better than to wait on a system Karen had already learned how to manipulate. I had seen it in Daniel's eyes. He wanted to help, but his hands were tied by protocols, by processes that moved slower than Karen's ambition. That's when the decision planted itself deep inside me. I wasn't going to play defense anymore. The first step in any conflict is always the same. Know your enemy. And I didn't know Karen. Not really. All I had was the image, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and sharper rules. But no one escalates like that without reason. There was something under the surface, and I needed to dig it out. Fran disagreed. "You can't reason with a hurricane, Alex," she said softly. She was right, but reasoning wasn't my plan. I just needed to understand the storm. Thursday night gave me the opportunity. An HOA meeting. On the agenda, lawn aeration and holiday decoration guidelines. But tucked at the end, 3 minutes for resident input. It was a crack in her armor, and I intended to wedge myself into it. The clubhouse smelled of chlorine and despair. About 30 neighbors sat in stiff rows, their expressions worn, beaten down, the look of prisoners at a parole hearing they knew they'd lose. At the front sat Karen with her cronies, Brenda, the nervous mouse, and Gary, the overly tanned bully. Karen's gavel cracked like a whip as she barked orders and cut residents off mid-sentence. When my name was called, I walked to the mic. Calm, clear, and I laid it all out. The harassment, the fines, and finally the 2 men who had broken into my home. For the first time, I saw something stir in my neighbors. Heads nodded, whispers spread, recognition, maybe even solidarity. But Karen? She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She tapped her pen lazily against her notes as though I were a fly buzzing near her ear. And when my 3 minutes ended, she leaned forward, voice dripping with venom hidden in politeness. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Your time is up." She turned to the crowd. "As you know, our newest resident has had trouble complying with community standards. It's sad, really. One person's refusal to cooperate can affect us all. As for his dramatic accusations, the police found no evidence linking a random burglary to our association. Crime can happen anywhere." She shifted the blame with elegance, turned me into the problem, and then she twisted the knife. "In light of Mr. Peterson's repeated violations and his disregard for community harmony, I propose a special assessment to cover the legal fees his accusations have created and to hire private security patrols." Gasps rippled through the room. I watched as whatever flicker of support I had seen in my neighbor's eyes guttered out, smothered by fear of her power. And by the cost, she had just dropped squarely on their shoulders. It was brilliant. Terrifyingly brilliant. In 3 minutes, she had discredited me, isolated me, and painted herself as the victim. I left that clubhouse in silence, my chest burning. The civilized approach had failed spectacularly. Fran had been right. You can't reason with a hurricane, but hurricanes can be weathered, and sometimes they can be turned. The next morning, the neighborhood felt different. Not quieter, heavier. Like everyone was holding their breath, and all of them were holding me responsible. It started with the bills. A crisp new envelope on every doorstep, stamped, special, assessment, $500, due immediately. The memo line, enhanced security and legal contingencies, which was just Karen's polite way of saying, because Alex Peterson dared to open his mouth. The shift was instant. Friendly waves replaced with cold shoulders. Conversations cut short. Neighbors who used to chat about the weather now looked at me like I was a disease they could catch. Karen had made her move, and she had turned me into the villain of my own street. And then came the precision strikes. At dawn, a tow truck backed into my driveway. The driver barely made eye contact as he hooked up my car. "Violation," he muttered. Bylaw 74, subsection C, maintaining a vehicle in disrepair on private property. The so-called disrepair? a tiny, almost invisible drip of oil on the driveway concrete. It cost me $300 to get my car back, and another $200 fine to the HOA. The next day, two men in bright green uniforms ripped Fran's roses from the ground, their shovels cutting deep into the soil she had spent years perfecting. She banged on the window, tears streaking her face, but the men waved a work order with Karen's signature. "Violation of approved foliage list." They tore Beauty out by the roots while my wife watched helplessly from behind glass. It didn't stop. Every day, something new. Notices, fines, repairs we didn't need but were forced to pay for. 1,000 paper cuts designed to bleed us dry. Bureaucracy as a weapon, Karen's favorite caliber. I knew how to fight men with guns, men with bombs. But how do you fight a 300-page rule book? How do you battle an enemy who hides behind clipboards and bylaws, who uses legal fees and leans the way others? Use bullets? Fran was fading. The fire in her eyes dimmed. She spent less time outside, more time staring out the window at the bare patch where her roses had been. One night, her voice was so small I almost didn't hear it. Maybe we should. Just move. I looked at her, at the circles under her eyes, at the way her hands twisted nervously in her lap. Part of me wanted to agree, to pack everything, sell the house, and leave the nightmare behind. But another part of me, the part Karen had awakened, refused. "No," I said. My voice came out harder than I meant. "We're not running. This is our home." But I could see the weight pressing down on her, dragging her further under each day. Not everyone abandoned us. Freddie didn't. He was the neighborhood eccentric, retired accountant, crooked glasses, conspiracy theories scrawled on napkins. Most people avoided him, but now, he was the only one who didn't look at me like poison. One morning, he caught me at the curb as I collected the mail. He leaned in, whispering like a spy in enemy territory. She replaced the whole sprinkler. System last year. Cost a fortune. Said it was about water efficiency. But I saw the invoices. The company she used belongs to her brother-in-law. His eyes gleamed behind the crooked frames. "Follow the water, Alex. Follow the water." I nodded politely, though it sounded like just another one of Freddie's tangled conspiracies. Still, I tucked it away. Even broken clocks are right. Sometimes. And then came the letter. Thick, certified, heavy in my hand. Inside wasn't a bill. It was a foreclosure notice. According to the paperwork, the title to my home had transferred weeks earlier. A forged quitclaim deed, rubber-stamped, with a notary who didn't exist. A new trustee had scheduled an auction. 30 days out, my home would go on the block. I stood there in the kitchen, the letter trembling in my hand, the blood pounding in my temples. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was the end game. Karen Grant didn't just want us miserable. She wanted us gone. But why? Why us? Why this land? I looked around at the walls, the windows, the floorboards that creaked the same way they had for 200 years of Petersons. My family had built this ranch from dirt and sweat, held it through wars and droughts, and now, an HOA president, with a clipboard, wanted to erase it with forged signatures. Something inside me shifted, something I thought I had buried when I walked away from the life I used to live, the part of me that dismantled things, people, organizations. That part woke up, and it was hungry. I didn't call a lawyer. Lawyers fight on paper, and paper was Karen's battlefield. I needed my own. In 2 days, I turned my quiet ranch house into an intelligence hub. Cables, cameras, encrypted servers humming in the basement, motion sensors hidden in trees, audio bugs disguised as child safety devices planted near the clubhouse, even a GPS tracker on my own car, not to track myself, but to log every time it was towed or tampered with. Fran watched me work, her arms folded tight around herself. "Be careful, Alex." I only nodded. Careful was the only way I knew. I started with open source intel, property deeds, tax filings, HOA financial statements buried in a password-protected corner of the community website. Piece by piece, a picture came into focus. Karen Grant lived in the biggest house in Cedar Valley, drove a brand new luxury SUV, but on paper, her only income was a modest stipend for being HOA president. It didn't add up. That's when Freddie's words came back. Follow the water. I dug deeper. The sprinkler company, landscaping contracts, paving, pool maintenance, security services, every single major contract the HOA had signed in the last 3 years had gone to a company owned by Karen's family or a shell company tied to her inner circle. She hadn't just skimmed. She had built an empire out of our fees, funneling money to her own family through inflated contracts. A slush fund, siphoning our lives into her luxury SUV. Fraud, racketeering, enough to bury her for years, but it still didn't explain the obsession with me. She could have kept bleeding the community forever, quiet and untouchable. Why risk everything to target one man? Why send thugs into my house? Why force a foreclosure on me specifically? Something was missing, and then Freddie knocked on my door again, a faded plat map in his shaking hands. His voice was a whisper, his eyes wild with discovery. Look at the name, right here. I squinted at the yellowed ink. My property. The neighboring parcels, and scrawled across them in bold, faded letters, Grant Family Homestead. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just corruption. It wasn't just greed. For Karen, it was personal. She wasn't just trying to evict a neighbor. She was trying to reclaim what she believed was hers. And suddenly her madness made sense. The map lay on the dining table like a curse. Grant Family Homestead. Those 3 faded words explained months of madness. All the fines, the threats, the forged foreclosure. It wasn't just about control. It was obsession. Karen Grant didn't just want me gone. She wanted this land back. Fran stood beside me, arms crossed, her face pale. So, all of this, every letter, every fine, every man she's sent here, it's because of that? Her finger stabbed at the map. Because of something her family lost half a century ago? I nodded slowly. That's what it looks like. Her arms tightened around herself. Alex, that's insane. She's insane. I didn't argue. She was right. And that was the problem. You can predict a crook. You can bait a thief with greed. But zealots? Zealots burn the world down for belief. For the first time in years, I felt the old instincts take over completely. I had a mountain of evidence, enough to call the FBI, enough to bury her in court. But I knew how slowly justice ground forward. Months, years. And in the meantime, Karen would still rule the neighborhood, still poison Fran's life one envelope at a time, maybe worse. The civilized path wasn't enough. I couldn't let Fran live under siege, waiting for someone else to save us. No. If Karen wanted a war, she was going to get one. But it would be on my terms. That night, while Fran slept fitfully upstairs, I sat in the glow of the basement monitors, every camera feed flickering across the screens. I whispered it aloud, just to hear the words and make them real. I'm done playing defense. The plan formed like muscle memory. Simple principles I'd lived by in another life. Know your enemy, control the battlefield, weaponize their weakness. Karen's weapon had always been fear, the illusion of power. She made our neighbors too terrified to resist. If I could break that illusion, I could break her. But how? The answer came from her weakest link, Gary. The bronze-skinned, over-tanned, board member with greed written in his smirk. People like him always wanted more, and people like him were easy to push. I spoofed a phone number, disguised my voice with a modulator, pretended to be a rival contractor. I told Gary I knew about the kickbacks he was taking, and I was ready to double them if he pushed the next road project my way. The greed in his voice was immediate, hungry. We set a meeting. He showed up eager, expecting to shake hands with another, crook. Instead, he found a manila envelope on a park bench. Inside? Photos of him taking envelopes of cash captured by my long-lens camera, and a note. "You're being played. Karen's setting you up. Get a lawyer." It was a lie, of course. But fear is faster than truth. I watched from a distance as his smug expression crumbled into panic. He bolted for his car, and I knew exactly where. He was headed straight to Karen. A man like Gary doesn't confront in whispers. He explodes. 2 nights later, the audio bug I'd hidden in the clubhouse smoke detector came alive. I listened as Karen, Brenda, and Gary clashed. Gary shouted, "Accusations," Brenda cried. "And Karen?" Karen stayed ice cold. She framed him as the problem, fabricated evidence of embezzlement, and with Brenda's timid vote, cut him from the board. By morning, she'd turned him into a scapegoat. He was out. She was filing a police report to bury him. And that was the spark I needed. The HOA charter allowed residents to call an emergency meeting if 20% signed a petition. No one had dared before. But fear of fines wasn't as strong as fear of theft. So I cut the audio file. Just enough of Gary's voice accusing her. Just enough of her threatening him. No context. Just enough to ignite suspicion. Then I sent it. To every homeowner in Cedar Valley from an anonymous email. "The HOA board is collapsing. Our fees are being stolen. Demand an emergency meeting." The effect was immediate. Fury swept the neighborhood like wildfire. Neighbors who'd never so much as looked me in the eye were suddenly marching door to door, signing petitions. By noon, the threshold was met. By evening, Karen had no choice but to schedule an emergency meeting. The battlefield was chosen. But Karen wasn't going to walk into that room without a counterstrike. She would come for me first. I told Fran to go stay with her sister for the night. She refused. Her chin lifted, stubborn. "I'm not leaving you. We started this together. We finish it together, so we prepared." Cameras armed, doors reinforced. Every corner of the ranch, a trap. Around 8 p.m., an hour before the meeting, the van arrived. Not 2 clumsy thugs this time. 4 men. Professional. Silent. They moved with the kind of precision I recognized immediately. Military training, private contractors, killers for hire. Karen wasn't sending a message anymore. She was trying to erase me before I reached. That clubhouse. I waited in the shadows, pulse steady. The front lock popped with a hiss. The first man slipped inside, suppressed pistol raised. His partner followed. They paused, listening. I was already behind them. The closet door exploded outward, slamming the second man against the frame. I caught the first by the wrist, twisted. Hard. His gun dropped with a crunch as his wrist snapped. A knee to the chest, an elbow to the neck, he folded to the floor. The second fought harder, but I was faster. His shot missed, plaster exploding behind me. I scooped up the fallen weapon, aimed low, and fired once. His scream tore through the silence as he dropped, clutching a bleeding thigh. Glass shattered at the back. 2 more, flooding in through. The patio. One cleared the kitchen, shouting. I tackled him into the marble counter. He went down cold. The last one grazed my shoulder with a bullet, pain searing hot. I grabbed the fire extinguisher off the wall, blasted his face with white foam, and ended it with a single strike to the temple. 30 seconds. 4 men neutralized. My house was wrecked. My shoulder burned. But Fran was safe. I zip-tied the conscious ones, duct-taped their mouths, dialed 911, calmly reported, 4 intruders secured, 1 gunshot wound. Send units. Then I sat one down, ripped the tape from his mouth. My voice dropped to the tone I hadn't used in years. "Who sent you?" He glared, stayed silent. "Look, around," I whispered, leaning close. "Your friends are in my basement. You've got one chance. Talk now." or wait for the police. Fear cracked his mask. Finally, he muttered, "Grant! Karen Grant!" "I know that," I said coldly. "Why? Why send you?" His eyes flicked to mine. He hesitated, and then the truth spilled out in fragments, jagged and ugly. "We're consultants, private security. Corporate clients hire us to solve problems. Quietly. She's not just HOA, she's management." The name he gave me twisted everything I thought I knew. Landev Pro. Not just a woman with a clipboard, not just a zealot clinging to family land. Karen Grant wasn't the mastermind. She was a pawn, a middle manager in a massive corporate machine, and I had just declared war on all of it. The man's words echoed in my ears long after I'd duct-taped his mouth shut again. She's not the client. She's management, Landev Pro. For days, I had thought Karen Grant was the monster, a zealot, a woman obsessed with reclaiming her so-called family land. But the truth was worse. She was an employee, a pawn dressed in pearls, running a neighborhood like a criminal franchise, Landev Pro, a development company, a big one. They had built Cedar Valley Estates, then installed Karen as their iron-fisted president. She wasn't bleeding us for herself. She was siphoning for them. Every special assessment, every bloated landscaping contract, every fine was revenue funneled back to corporate masters, and I had threatened their cash cow. Suddenly, everything made sense. The thugs, the forged foreclosure, the kill team in my house. Karen wasn't just angry. She was expendable, disposable, just a manager protecting the bottom line of something far bigger and far colder than personal vendettas. But it was Freddie's map that kept burning in my mind. The Grant family homestead. That had to be a lie. The intruder had practically laughed when I mentioned it. Her family had never owned anything. They were dirt-poor tenant farmers. Even her name was manufactured. The family legacy was a script, a cover story to explain away her obsession if anyone started asking questions. They had planted it. Manufactured history, the kind of psychological trick corporations specialize in. Wrap theft in a legend, and it looks less like greed and more like destiny. For a moment, the weight of it staggered me. I wasn't just fighting a woman with a clipboard. I was fighting an empire. Faceless executives in glass towers who had decided our neighborhood was nothing more than an ATM. And Karen Grant? She wasn't a zealot. She was middle management with a mandate. I stood in my wrecked kitchen, plaster dust falling where bullets had shredded the wall, blood soaking my shirt. The enormity of it pressed down like a mountain. How do you fight a corporation? How do you bring down a machine that can send 4 professionals to your door without blinking? For a minute, I felt small, powerless. Then I looked at Fran, still, gripping the lamp she'd armed herself with upstairs, her knuckles white, her face pale. I thought of her roses ripped from the earth, of her voice when she whispered, "Maybe we should move," and that small, powerless feeling hardened into something sharper. I didn't care how big they were. They had brought their war to my home. Now I was going to bring it to theirs. But not with bullets. Not yet. With truth. The HOA emergency meeting was hours away. Karen would walk in thinking she still had control, thinking she could spin Gary's exile, bury the whispers, crush the petition with the same icy confidence she'd always wielded. But this time, I wasn't coming empty-handed. On my table lay the pieces, the audio confession from the mercenary, the financial records showing the kickback web, the bug from the secret meeting where Gary had screamed about Karen's schemes, and Freddie's cursed map, not evidence, but theater. I wasn't going to the police first, not to the FBI, not to the courts. I was going to the people she had ruled through fear, the neighbors who had bowed their heads, written their checks, lived under her thumb. Because power doesn't vanish when you arrest a tyrant. It shatters when her followers stop believing. That night, I walked into the clubhouse bleeding under, My jacket, adrenaline numbing the pain. The place was packed, every chair filled, people standing against the walls, faces tight with anger and confusion. At the front, Karen sat at the head table, perfect hair, perfect posture. But her jaw was set harder than usual. She scanned the room, searching. And when her eyes landed on me, shock cracked through her mask. I wasn't supposed to be alive. The meeting began in chaos. Voices rose, questions fired like arrows. Where's Gary? Where's our money? Karen banged her gavel until the room echoed, her voice slicing through the noise. Order! This is not a mob! She tried to spin it. Claimed Gary was the thief, that he had been removed for embezzlement, that she was protecting the community from him. It almost worked. Fear makes people want to believe in order, even when it's a lie. The room wavered. That's when I stepped forward. I didn't wait for permission. I stood at the microphone and spoke, my voice low but carrying. My name is Alex Peterson, and I have something you need to hear. Karen shot to her feet, her voice sharp. You are out of order. I ignored her. You've all been paying fines, fees, special assessments. You've been told it was about maintaining community standards. That was a lie. I pulled the recorder from my pocket. Tonight, 4 men came to my house. They weren't burglars. They were professionals, sent to silence me before this meeting. Here's what one of them told me. I pressed play. The man's voice, raw with pain and fear, filled the clubhouse. He spoke of Karen, of the fake contracts, of the money funneled to family and friends, and then the name, Landev Pro. The room gasped. Murmurs swelled. Karen's mask cracked. She turned pale, gripping the table with white knuckles. But I wasn't done. This was never about flowers, or garbage cans, or paint colors. This was about greed. And Karen, she dressed that greed in a story. I held up Freddie's map. The Grant family homestead. She told herself, and maybe even some of you, that she was fighting for her family's legacy, that this was her land, but that was a lie too. I hit play on the second recording, Karen's secret meeting with Gary. The part where he shouted about Landev, about the fake story, and Karen's furious voice snapped, "You will be silent." The silence in the room was suffocating. And then, like a dam breaking, the voices turned. "She's a liar!" someone shouted. "And a thief!" another added. "My fees, my money!" The anger erupted, no longer at me, but at her, a tidal wave of rage she could no longer contain. Karen's eyes darted for the door, but there was nowhere to run, and that was when the main doors burst open. Not more mercenaries, police, detectives, Sheriff Daniels at the front. His voice carried above the chaos. "Karen Grant, you're under arrest. Conspiracy, fraud, multiple counts of assault." The room exploded as the cuffs snapped around her. Wrists. Karen turned her head. Her eyes locked on mine, burning with something beyond hate. Her lips moved soundlessly. 2 words. "You're dead." It wasn't a threat from a petty tyrant anymore. It was a promise from a corporation that had just lost its pawn. Peace doesn't come with handcuffs. I thought the moment Karen Grant was led out in front of her neighbors, wrists bound, her icy mask shattered, I'd feel relief. But instead, I felt a hollow ache in my chest. The kind you get when you know the story isn't over, just shifting into something darker. For a few days, chaos reigned in Cedar Valley. News vans lined the pristine streets. Reporters shoved microphones into startled faces. Neighbors who had once avoided me like the plague now knocked on my door with casseroles, apologies, and tearful confessions about their own fines and harassment. For the first time, I wasn't the villain of the neighborhood, but Karen was gone, and yet the machine kept humming. Landev Pro released a statement within hours of her arrest. They called her a rogue employee, a lone bad apple. They cut her loose faster than I thought possible, disowning her like she was toxic waste. She acted independently, they said. We are shocked and appalled by her actions. It was neat, too neat, because I knew the truth. Karen hadn't been a rogue player. She'd been the perfect employee. Loyal, cold, ruthless. She had played their game to perfection, and when she got sloppy, they sacrificed her to protect the brand. But I wasn't going to let them bury her crimes in paperwork and press releases. So I did what Karen never expected me to do. I fought them in the light. I uploaded everything, the audio files, the photos, the financial records, to reporters who had been circling like vultures. I gave on-camera statements, naming Landev Pro and outlining their scheme. The HOA front, the inflated contracts, the shell corporations. I connected the dots for anyone willing to listen, and people listened. The story spread like fire. HOA corruption. Wasn't new, but this was organized theft. A nationwide development giant using neighborhoods as piggy banks. Other communities began digging into their own finances. Class action lawsuits piled up. Congressional hearings were demanded for E. The first time, Landev Pro bled, but corporate beasts don't die easy. They buried me in countersuits. Claimed defamation. Claimed the audio was doctored. The documents forged. They hired an army of lawyers to slow everything to a crawl. They flooded the airwaves with ads about building the future of America. They couldn't erase the truth, but they could drown it in noise. Meanwhile, life in Cedar Valley tried to patch itself back together. The HOA dissolved in the wake of Karen's arrest. A new charter was written by the residents themselves. Fines were slashed, rules dismantled. For the first time, people planted whatever flowers they wanted. Doors painted in colors other than beige sprouted like rebellion. And then there was Freddie. Against all odds, the man with the crooked glasses and tinfoil theories was elected the new HOA president. He gave a victory speech about mind control. Rays that made everyone laugh, but it wasn't mockery this time. It was affection. Freddie wasn't feared. He was loved. And maybe that was exactly what we needed after years of Karen's reign. But none of it erased the weight I carried. At night, Fran and I sat on the deck, her head resting on my good shoulder, her new garden blooming wild and untamed in the moonlight. She looked at me one evening, her eyes searching. "Is it really over?" she asked softly. I wanted to say yes, wanted to lie and give her peace, but the truth sat heavy on my tongue. Karen was in a jail cell, yes, but she hadn't broken. Every court date, she refused deals, refused confessions. She was stubborn enough to go down swinging, and somewhere in that cold gaze of hers, I could still see the message she mouthed to me. You're dead, and she wasn't wrong. Because when you fight a corporation like Landev Pro, you don't just wound them, you paint a target on your back. Every time I pulled out of my driveway, I scanned the mirrors. Every night I double-checked the locks, the cameras. The 4 mercenaries I'd subdued hadn't been freelancers. They were proof the company had resources far beyond Karen's HOA clipboard. If they wanted to, they could erase me in 100 ways that never made the news. Fran deserved peace, deserved safety, and the thought gnawed at me. Had I destroyed her chance at it by refusing to walk away? But then I looked at her wildflowers, a riot of color spilling across the backyard. And I remembered why I couldn't run. Some things are worth fighting for, even if it means never truly being safe again. Weeks passed. The lawsuits multiplied. Landev's stock plummeted. Federal investigators, pressured by the storm of public outrage, announced a formal probe. For the first time, the untouchable giant staggered. And still, in the quiet of our nights, I wondered, had I really won? Or had I just traded one war for another? Because here's the truth no one wants to admit. When you stare down monsters long enough, something in you changes. Something in you starts to look like them. And I wasn't sure if the man I had been, the man who came home for Fran, who wanted boring and quiet, would ever come back again. Sometimes peace is just the quiet before the next strike. The news vans eventually left Cedar Valley. The lawsuits wound their way through courts, investigators circled Landev Pro like sharks, and the neighborhood breathed again. Lawns grew wild, with color. Kids played in the street without the weight of constant surveillance. Freddie strutted around with his crooked glasses and new title, pitching bylaws about tinfoil hats that made everyone laugh. On the surface, it almost looked like healing, but I could never shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Because Karen's words still haunted me, the way her lips had moved as the cuffs tightened on her wrists. You're dead. Not desperation, not bluff. A promise. And promises like that don't die in holding cells. I told myself she was finished. That Landev Pro had cut her loose. That she was powerless. But every time the phone rang late at night, every time a strange car idled too long at the end of our road, my pulse tightened. I knew better. Karen was dangerous, but the people behind her were worse. And yet, there was another part of me. A darker part. One I'd tried to bury when I left my old life behind. That part welcomed the tension. It told me to stay sharp, to keep my edges honed, to never forget that monsters don't stop hunting just because you wound them. Fran saw it in me. She saw the way I checked the locks twice, the way I lingered, at the windows scanning the tree line. One night she touched my hand gently. "Alex, are you ever going to stop fighting?" I didn't answer, because the truth was, I didn't know how. But fate has a cruel way of answering questions for you. It started small. A neighbor down the road found his property suddenly hit with thousands in compatibility fees from the county. Another woke up to find his home listed for foreclosure, despite never missing a payment. The fingerprints were all over it. The same forged documents, the same predatory tactics. Landev Pro hadn't stopped. They'd just shifted their focus. My fight with Karen had exposed them, but it hadn't killed the machine. It had just made it angrier. That's when I realized something chilling. Cedar Valley wasn't unique. There were other neighborhoods, other HOAs just like ours, controlled like puppet theaters by the same faceless corporation. And they were, still out there, still bleeding families dry while Karen took the fall. One night, I spread maps across my dining table, connecting the dots of communities tied to Landev Pro. Property records. Corporate filings, a spiderweb of greed stretching across counties and states. The scope was staggering. Fran walked in, saw the chaos of papers and pins, and stopped cold. "This isn't our fight anymore," she whispered. Her voice broke something in me. Because I knew she was right. We'd survived. Our home was safe. Our neighborhood had rebuilt. We could have walked away, but I couldn't, because I had seen too much. And when you see the truth, really see it, you either bury it or you burn for it. I chose the burn. I started sending packages. Anonymous files to journalists, lawyers, regulators, each one containing evidence from Cedar Valley, tied with strings that pointed outward to other communities. And every time one of those packages went out, I imagined Karen's cold eyes watching me from her cell. She would know, she would hear, and she would never forgive. Weeks later, I got a letter. No return address, just a single sheet of paper, typed with no signature. "We know who you are. We know what you've done. Stop, or you won't be the only one who pays." I read it twice, then set it down slowly on the table. Fran stared at it, her face draining of color. "Alex?" Her voice shook. "They're still coming." I nodded. My jaw tightened. "Then let them." But inside, a storm was raging. Because I wasn't afraid for myself. I had spent years walking into fire. I knew how to survive. But Fran, she was my anchor, my reason. And I couldn't shake the fear that the next attack wouldn't be for me. That night, I lay awake listening to the quiet hum of the house, every creak magnified. My hand rested on the pistol beside the bed, the same one I swore I'd Never need again. Sleep didn't come. Just a question. Had I saved my home, only to doom the woman I loved? By dawn, I had my answer. If they were coming for me, then I needed to hit them first. Hard enough that they'd think twice about ever touching Fran. I wasn't just going to expose Landev Pro anymore. I was going to dismantle them, piece by piece. And if Karen Grant thought her promise still held power, I'd show her exactly. What happens when you try to haunt a man who has nothing left to lose? This wasn't about one neighborhood anymore. This was a war, and I was stepping back into it willingly. The night of the final storm came without warning. It was late, past midnight, when the power cut out. The house sank into silence, darker than the sky outside. My cameras flickered, then went dead. A perfect blackout. Fran stirred beside me. "Alex?" Her voice trembled barely more than a whisper. I pressed a finger to her lips. Listened. Footsteps crunched outside. Slow. Careful. Professional. They hadn't forgotten me. They hadn't forgiven me. I eased Fran toward the hidden crawl space beneath the floorboards. "Stay quiet. Don't move. No matter what you hear." She wanted to argue, but the fear in her eyes told me she understood. She kissed me once, fast, and disappeared into the dark. Then I picked up the pistol. When the glass shattered in the living room, I was already moving. Two silhouettes slipped inside, rifles raised. They swept the room with precision. Not amateurs. But they weren't ready for me. I struck from the shadows, low and fast. The first never saw me coming. One blow to the throat, another to the temple. He crumpled. The second spun, muzzle flashing, bullets tearing into the wall where I'd been. A heartbeat earlier. I dropped low, fired once. His weapon clattered against the hardwood as he fell. But there were more. Always more. Voices outside. At least 3, maybe 4. I knew I couldn't hold them here forever, so I didn't try. I led them through the kitchen, down the back hall, out into the yard where my cameras, my traps, still hummed on backup batteries. Motion lights blazed, alarms screamed, and the mercenaries froze just long enough for me to move. Gunfire erupted in the garden, shattering Fran's flower pots, tearing through the soil where her roses once grew. I hit the ground hard, returned fire, felt the heat of bullets slicing the air around me. One went down, another bolted for cover. The third pressed forward, reckless, hungry. I let him, and when he reached the deck, I triggered the failsafe, the pressure charge I'd rigged beneath the old wood steps. It wasn't lethal, but the blast sent him flying backward, screaming. As shrapnel tore his leg apart, silence followed. Heavy, absolute. The survivors ran. They weren't here to die. Just to scare. Just to remind me that the machine could always reach out and touch me. And as I stood there, chest heaving, shoulder burning, smoke curling from the pistol in my hand, I realized something. This wasn't Karen anymore. This was the machine. Landev Pro, faceless, endless, unkillable. They could throw money at 100 more men like these. And if I stayed here, if I kept waiting for them to come to me, sooner or later they'd win. But then I remembered Karen's eyes as the handcuffs closed. "You're dead." Her promise. Her prophecy. And I smiled, because she was right. The man who wanted peace, the man who dreamed of a quiet life on a ranch with his wife, that man was gone. Dead. What remained was something else. By morning, the sheriff's deputies had come and gone, collecting the wounded mercenary, filing their reports. But their eyes told me everything. They couldn't protect me. Not from this. Fran held me in the kitchen as sunlight bled through the curtains. Her hands shook against my chest. "Alex, we can't live like this. Not forever." I kissed her. Hair. Whispered into it. "We won't." And I meant it. Not because I planned to surrender. Not because I planned to run. Because I planned to end it. I didn't tell Fran the details. Some burdens you can't share, no matter how much you want to. But in the weeks that followed, as she replanted her roses and tried to stitch normalcy back into our lives, I worked in the shadows. I contacted old friends, men and women who knew how to dig, how to expose, how to dismantle giants from the inside out. Not soldiers this time, investigators, hackers, journalists, people who could fight a war without bullets. We went after Landev Pro like wolves, exposed offshore accounts, political bribes, land grabs hidden in fake trusts. Every leak was a dagger, every article another cut, and slowly the giant began to stumble. It wasn't fast, it wasn't clean, but corruption thrives in darkness, and we were dragging it into the light. And somewhere in a cell with concrete walls and no windows, Karen Grant surely heard, surely knew. She had promised me death, but the only death she would witness was her empire, collapsing piece by piece. One evening, months later, Fran and I sat on the porch as the sun dipped behind the valley. The air smelled of fresh soil, wildflowers, and the faint sweetness of her new rose bushes. She leaned into me, her voice quiet. "Do you think it's over?" I thought about the men who had come in the night, about the machines still grinding, in boardrooms and courtrooms, about the fact that monsters don't disappear just because you shine a light on them. "No," I said softly. "It's never over." She tensed, but before fear could take root, I added, "But it's enough, because sometimes victory isn't about ending the war. It's about giving the people you love the chance to breathe again, to plant flowers, to live without fear, even if only for a while." As the sun slipped away and the valley turned gold, I realized something I hadn't in months. The land beneath us wasn't just soil. It wasn't just property. It was memory. Blood and sweat and stories buried deep. 200 years of Petersons holding the line. And now, one more. Karen had tried to erase that. Landev Pro had tried to steal it. But we were still here, and sometimes survival is the greatest defiance of all. You've heard this confession. Now wait until you hear the next one.